side of this area, surrounded in red, you'll see something that's a little bit more brown. Then you'll see a purple color. And then for, I guess, lack of a better descriptor, you see kind of a mustard yellow color. Kind of makes me want a hot dog, actually. You'll see these different colors on this map, and they each represent a different land use district. You'll also see a green color that represents open space. And so as I speak about some of the changes coming up, when I mention the residential district, it's those more western portions that are brown. If I speak of the residential reserve area, it's that mustard color. And if I talk about a mixed use area, it's that purple. And then if I mention the open space, it'll be kind of that green wetland looking area that's kind of spread throughout the entirety of it. And then when we talk about the greenway, there's a dashed green line that goes around the entirety of this property, and that is a proposed greenway. So speaking of those residential districts, one of the things that we heard loud and clear from the community, we heard loud and clear from both city and county commissioners, was that overall the residential densities are just too low. We went back and looked, and part of the concern that we heard was if there's going to be an extension of urban services up to this area, we should have an adequate density to match the investment in urban services that would be in place. And so we looked at it, and what the residential district, that was that brown part on the western part of that image, originally was proposed to be was 6 units per acre. And so staff has proposed that that goes to 10 units per acre. We wanted to have a logical nexus between kind of our recommendation and other parts of the comp plan. So I'll note that 10 units per acre is the maximum density allowed in the urban residential land use category. So we do have a precedent for that number. One of the more concerning things that we heard, or one of the concerns that the commissions expressed that we heard, was that the 1 unit per acre residential reserve district was the one that was really too low. And so staff went back and evaluated that and is recommending that that go from 1 unit per acre to 6 units per acre. Again, wanting to have some kind of connection, a logical nexus for this number. That 6 units per acre is the same as what our residential preservation land use category allows. So there is a precedent for that number as well. And so when we look at this development, the residential district would be essentially the urban residential land use category, and the residential reserve would be essentially the residential preservation land use category in terms of the maximum allowable densities. Another thing that we heard from both the public and our commissioners was that this plan needed some phasing. And so as we went through it, we looked at what are some ways that this could logically be phased out. And having the different land use districts really provided an opportunity to do that. So the residential district, again, that brown part on the western side of the development, as well as the mixed use districts, those are those purple areas, would be considered phase 1. And then the residential reserve, that was that mustard color, is now considered phase 2. We did not put open space in a phase because if the greenway and part of the open space in phase 2 or around the residential reserve district wanted to proceed ahead, we didn't want it to be restricted to phase 2. I think we'd like the greenway to be available for people as soon as possible and not have to wait for certain phasing. But there's a threshold that we're proposing now that would be what would allow phase 2 occur, phase 2 to occur. And so the phase 1 residential and mixed use districts would have to meet a threshold of residential development and non-residential development to occur before phase 2 can begin. Or we would have to meet the horizon year, which is 2035 of the comprehensive plan before phase 2 could move forward. So there's a built-in phasing there with the idea that development would occur over time, beginning with what's adjacent to existing development and then moving out from there. There are a couple of additional master plan additions to the master plan. When we look at the planned development land use category, again, this is what is proposed for this area. There are certain requirements that master plans must include, and kind of through working with the community and working with the agent for the property owner, we updated the master plan to include some design guidelines, development guidelines for energy efficiency, particularly through land use and transportation, because that's where you're going to see a lot of that energy efficiency occurring, as well as crime prevention through design. I think a lot of people may have heard of CPTED, that is crime prevention through environmental design. So there are very goals for reducing crime through the way communities are designed. And we wanted to make sure that those are going to be reflected as well. One of the other things we did is worked very closely with some of the existing neighborhoods in the vicinity of this area, particularly Buckhead. They had representation that contacted us and worked very closely with us as well to ensure that there's compatibility between future development and existing development. And part of that is provided through a 1,000-foot wide area that surrounds the Buckhead neighborhood as well as the neighborhood directly south of Buckhead, and made sure that there's a transition of land uses from the existing neighborhood to the proposed development. And so there would be the greenway followed by additional open space, and then residential uses would start at a lower density and then kind of move up as you move away from the neighborhood. We also noted that the mixed use land use district, one that would be more intense and have a variety of uses and not just residential, would be no closer than 1,000 feet from those existing neighborhoods. The second amendment in this set was the map amendment. And as I've mentioned a couple of times, the plan would be to take it from the rural land use category, as well as a little bit of suburban land use category. If you look at the current on the left side of it, the little sliver of purple at the southern part of this is suburban, and it would take the entirety of it to plan development. There would also be a rezoning that implements this, and that would take this area to the plan development zoning district. Essentially what that does is it gives it a zoning district that's kind of a placeholder until a planned unit development is created for this area. And that's more of a kind of a master plan zoning district, if you will. For many of the same reasons, we're recommending that this be found consistent with the comprehensive plan. And so that is our recommendation to the commissions. A lot of the same objectives and policies that I mentioned, where it is intended for urban services to be in the entirety of the city of Tallahassee. We also looked at some other things, like the current land use designation of that portion of the arch is rural. And if you look at the rural agricultural land use category, it specifically states that urban services are not planned or programmed for the area. And since there has been a development agreement since 1990 to plan for urban services in the area, that would be inconsistent to keep it in the rural/agriculture land use category. And I think at this point, we would be happy to take any questions. So I'll turn it back to Sheree and Wayne.
Okay. So I'm sure Wayne will want to speak just a moment, but just to remind you, if you wanted to say something, hover your mouse over your screen. At the bottom, it looks like a little person with the 3 lines next to him. Click on that, and you should see a list, and then it gives you the option to raise your hand. And I do have, it looks like 1 person so far. Wayne, did you want to say something before I go to that?
Well, I think what might be helpful, Artie, if you could just bring up the overall map that shows where the urban service boundary line is. I think that may be helpful for us to, as we're answering questions, we can kind of point and talk to areas of the property.
Okay. All right.
With that, I'd be glad to take questions and comments.
Okay, I'm going to start. Grant, you hand up. I'm going to unmute you. So Grant Gellert, if you wanted to say something, I'm muting you now.
Yes, I was wondering, has there been any documentation of the need for this amount of development and housing stock into the city. This seems like, especially with the changes to making everything more intense, this seems to be a lot of population increase, development increase. So I was wondering if there has been a study documenting the need for this type of expansion.
Okay, thank you, Grant.
Artie, would you like to follow up on the population accommodation that we've done?
Yes, I can speak to that some. There has been some look of that. We continually look at the projected population increases that we see. We have seen that the rate in which our population is growing has slowed some, but it is still moving in the increase area. We are not losing population. We're continuing to increase it. It may not be as fast as we were a decade ago, but we do see population increases. We have looked at the general size of families in Leon County. The average size, I believe, is 2.33 per members per family, per household unit, if you will. And we looked at that, and we looked at the need for some level of flexibility in the market, following guidelines that came from what used to be the Department of Community Affairs. We added a multiplier. And so we have a need for approximately 56,000 dwelling units by 2045. And we can kind of look at each benchmark year by year from here to that point. There has been some analysis done that looks at the development potential that exists within the current urban services area. And we have done some numbers looking at that. I know in 2007, there's the evaluation and appraisal report, often called the EAR. That was something that is required by state to look at your comprehensive plan every 7 years. And so in 2007, we looked at that, and there was some analysis done. That analysis showed that using the assumptions that were given in the EAR, there would be enough land to accommodate kind of all the growth that is needed within the urban service area. However, once you start breaking down what those assumptions are, it makes it a little bit more challenging to agree with that analysis. So one of the things that it looked at was assuming the maximum density allowed by the land use category did not account for zoning. And so essentially what that does is it assumes that every vacant parcel in all of the community would be rezoned to the highest density intensity allowed in the land use category. That is not something that can be done, one, because there are laws against spot zoning, as well as probably not something that is realistic to do. It assumed that every property inside the urban service area that is 2 acres or greater, even if there's a home on it, would be considered vacant and would be redeveloped. If you ask people who have their home on 2 acres, they're probably not necessarily wanting to subdivide that property, or they may have done so. It assumes that every vacant parcel in the community would go for sale and be able to be developed. And people who own property don't necessarily want to be forced to sell their property. And so there's a lot of assumptions in there that make that analysis a little bit unrealistic. And so when we start looking at things like the likelihood of property that would be developed, the likelihood of people not caring if we cut down trees and remove historic structures in order to develop the properties at the maximum density, it becomes unrealistic that we would be able to accommodate all of the growth in the community without at least looking at and making adjustments to the urban service area.
While we're on this map, Grant, I think it's really important. If you notice where the urban service line is, the red line, the phasing that Artie spoke to earlier was basically everything inside the existing urban service area boundary today would be the phase one. And we would put limitations, and we have those limitations in the amendments that we have moving forward Tuesday night, that everything outside of the urban service area is considered phase two. So there either has to be more than 50% of that phase one area that has been developed, which will show that there's a demonstrated need of additional lands up in that area, or the property remains undevelopable till 2035, plain and simple. So we heard the community's concerns about leapfrog development, about pushing intense development sooner than would be required or potentially needed. And so we have basically through this comp plan would limit what has been previously approved in the urban services agreement, which basically said if they ask for utilities today, we have 1 year to get them to the edge of the property. Now, we do have staff online to talk about utilities if necessary, but I thought it was really important to say that everything outside of the urban service area today will be limited to being able to be developed until at least 2035.
Okay, Grant, I've got you unmuted. If you still needed to ask, or if you're finished with the question, if you could unraise your hand so I can keep track.
Oh,
Okay, and if that's okay, I'll go ahead and mute you and then go to our next person.
yep.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so our next person is Darwin Gamble. So Darwin, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you now.
Thank you very much and good morning, and thank you for the presentation. It demonstrates that you really can take public comment in real time during a virtual meeting. I'm Darwin Gamble, 1248 Halifax Court, and my question goes like this. Why are we rushing into implementing Goal 13 in the comprehensive plan, which is the Welaunee critical area, ahead of, instead of, and at the same time, excuse me, dragging our feet implementing Goal 11, which is the Southern Strategy? If you look at the Southern Strategy in the comprehensive plan, it looks good on paper, but if you walk through the neighborhoods, you don't see any signs of it. You see vacant lots, vacant houses, substandard houses and trailers, places where you wouldn't think people are living, but they are. And it looks like that's untouched. And that area has been within the urban services area for a long time. And here we are now expanding the urban services area way out in the northeast for new development. What's been the thinking behind that? Why give priority to Goal 13 over Goal 11?
I'll be glad to answer. So, Darwin, we adopted Goal 13 years ago. We've adopted, for the Southern Strategy area, we adopted 5 study areas and have series of recommendations for each one of those study areas. We have implemented a lot of the things that we can from a land use perspective and a comp plan perspective from the Southern Strategy policies. A lot of it is just basically due to lack of interest of developing on the south side of the land for various reasons. We had here's things that I do see happening. So we've tried to get developments to extend down South Monroe Street, Orange Avenue. We have major infrastructure projects that have occurred in the south side. And in fact, I started running some numbers about the infrastructure dollars that we have spent on the south side versus all parts in the community. And within the last 10 years, I've seen a 2-to-1 ratio of dollars going towards the south side than to the north side. So we absolutely recognize there's been some deficiencies on our south side with our sidewalks, with our street repavings, with our water sewer projects, water quality projects, and the government has responded, quite frankly. And so I'm very proud of the things that have occurred on that south side. I know that about a year ago, we presented, planning department staff presented that just along the Orange Avenue corridor, within the next 6 years, we expect over $1.4 billion of public investment within that area. So that is absolutely some things that I think are positives. In this particular case, I would really describe this modification of this urban service area boundary as a scrivener's error that should have been corrected in 1990 when the city and county agreed to annex this property. And there was an urban services agreement that basically said, we will provide urban infrastructure to this property if you annex into the city. And they did. So it's basically realigning the line to match the agreements that were made a long time ago. And as I stated before, we have, through this comp plan amendment process, the ability to tighten the screws down onto when that area can be developed in the future. Whereas today, we don't necessarily have that limitation. So I think this is a positive that we can start controlling a growth sequence in this area. And I think lastly, I'd say that right now, Welaunee is under the ownership of one individual per se, or one board. We have worked through their representative to come up with a plan that representative is okay with at this point. But I'm starting to see signs that that ownership is going to be transitioning into other family members' hands. And I think we can all understand the complexities is the more people you get involved in making decisions regarding land use, the more difficult it is to get some of the things that I think from the community perspective, we think is very important. So in 2014, 64% of the folks who voted on the referendum from Blueprint voted to extend this roadway corridor through this piece of property. And so what we don't want to do is put a road through a piece of property without thinking ahead and say, what are the impacts to the land use, to the adjacent property owners? And we coordinate land use and transportation together. And that is a phrase that you have probably heard from our staff for the last 10 to 15, 20 years, is you can't take one without the other because they both influence the decisions that you make in both ways. So with that, I think that's all I have to address that issue, the question.
Thank you very much for that answer. Can I say one more thing?
Sure.
Okay, I'm just going by what I see, Wayne. I walk through those South Side neighborhoods. Before the coronavirus, I was registering voters there for about a year. And I just go by what I see and compare that to all the energy going to help out one family, one very rich family in the Northeast. And it's going to help them tremendously. And I see people with very little means who need a lot more help on the South Side. And that I'm just going by what I see with my own eyes. And that's just an observation.
Yes, sir. But as I mentioned, the land use decisions and the infrastructure decisions that have been made are truly reflective of the government's intention to try to address some of the urban issues down in that area. Now, we realize there's probably a lot of social issues that we have to deal with. We can't deal with that through the comprehensive plan per se. So it's a community-wide issue. I think we all got to kind of join in and figure out how to tackle those. I'm very proud. So like the CRA, along Orange Avenue, the Tallahassee Housing Authority. We have obligated ourselves up to $1 million for redevelopment of a very rundown housing development.
The Orange Avenue Apartments.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
And so now they're working with us, and even though they haven't even started construction of that phase, they want to begin a second phase, which when we start seeing those changes down there, it's public investment in these areas, and it starts lifting up the surrounding area. Sometimes it's very difficult to do public investment in parts of our community. For instance, when we talked about relocating the police department on the South Side, that would infuse about $60 to $80 million of public investment to lift up some areas in our community and provide opportunities for additional concentrated growth in and around the police department. And the community rejected that notion at that time. So there was a huge opportunity for the South Side that was lost. But that's okay. The community spoke, and we listened to the community, and we relocated the police department where the community said they wanted located.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sheree, do we have other speakers? Sheree?
Sure, you're muted if you're trying to speak.
Okay, so yeah, if you could, everyone could please, thank you. I'm trying to go back and forth with 3 or 4 different tasks here. So Darwin, if you could turn your hand off, thank you. And then Grant, you still have your hand up from before. I wanted to make sure I didn't cut you off.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I just had a side question since I have everybody here. Is Southwood, the existing Southwood included in that? And is that currently approved, or would that be a future land use amendment? I'm just thinking about build out around the city of Tallahassee.
Artie, I'm not quite sure I understood the question because he faded out a little bit, but it sounded like is all of Southwood included in, is it the Southern Strategy Comp Plan update? Oh. Not the Southern Strategy, the south side sector, southeast sector.
Okay. I'll ask the question again. How's that? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes.
The existing Southwood project is coming to a build out point, it looks like, from me driving around that area. Yes. I believe Southwood Plantation, or the original plantation, had some additional lands further to the east. Are those additional lands further to the east, are they currently approved for development, or would that be a future land use amendment and change to expand further to the east?
A future land use amendment would be required.
So it is very likely that Southwood, similar to Welaunee, will be approaching the city sometime in the future, whenever that may be, for further expansion to the east.
It is possible. Everything's possible, Grant. One thing I will say about if the further they go east, there is a lot of environmental areas out there, significant environmental areas that have to be preserved. And so when we talk about developments meeting maximum densities and intensities, I don't even think Southwood at this point has even reached the maximum potential they could based on a lot of the constraints they had to deal with out in there. So, but yeah, bottom line is they would have to come in and do a land use amendment. I think they would even have to move the urban service area boundary, if I'm not mistaken, which would be another city-county joint action.
Okay. I'll put my hand down. I want to thank you folks for putting on the presentation. I've been a little lax on my tracking land use issues recently, which is only so much time in the day.
Yeah,
well, thank you for being here, Grant.
Okay.
I always appreciate you.
Thank you, Grant. Okay, so now we've got several people in line to speak. And the next person is Steve Bean or Steve Ben. So excuse me if I don't say it properly. So you're unmuted now.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, it's Steve Bean.
Steve Bean.
Often mispronounced. So I have a couple of things. So I was interested to hear the comment about, well, there's not a lot of developer interest in building on the south side. It seems to me, I mean, it's obvious just looking at what's happened in the last 30 years, developers want to go north. And if there were no planning, that's where most of the development would be. But it seems to me if we're going to have planning and we're going to try and influence what happens, and we want to change that and have more development in the South, the government can have some influence there. And if there is going to be this need for more dwelling units as population goes up, if we don't facilitate development in the north, and people need homes, developers have to go somewhere. Isn't that a way to encourage development in the south, as opposed to just kind of going along with the natural tendency of developers, which is inconsistent with what we want to do? So if this were denied, wouldn't that ultimately lead to more development in other parts of the existing city or in the south?
I don't know if I could answer that question without looking too far in the future. Mr. Bean, what I would say is that the zoning and the land use designation for the southern part of our community is pretty robust. In other words, a lot of development activity can happen on the south side today without any changes to the comp plan. I can tell you I have been a part of a number of development applications and rezonings along the corridor that when density is being proposed in certain areas, I can give you a 30-acre piece of property off of Ridge Road that the developer wanted to come in and propose some substantial amount of density. And the neighborhood said, no, we don't want it here. We don't want this type of development here. So we run into those issues all the time. Regarding public investment, there's a couple of projects that I think are really important that are occurring on the south side that, you know, just like if you build a new road or you enhance a new road and you lift up the corridor, and I hate to use Gain Street as an example, but that's an example where there was public investment in Cascades Park. There's public investments, and then after that public investment, a lot of private sector individuals responded because it showed that government was focusing in on an area and investing in the area. So on the south side, we have a number of major projects that are moving forward. We have the Airport Gateway project, which extends from the airport all the way to the FSU Stadium, both along Lake Bradford Road, as well as Spring Hill Road. That, I believe, is over a $70 million project that is in the planning stages today. We have FAMU Way that has almost nearly completed. It was our intention to have areas that are zoned very intense along FAMU Way. It is up to 45 dwelling units per acre. Once you build that infrastructure and you invest in the area, you're going to see private development respond. We also have the South Monroe corridor, sense of place plans from the connector bridge at Cascades Park down to Orange Avenue. We have Orange Avenue in the planning phase. We have South Monroe corridor. It's another, I want to say it's about a $20 million project on South Monroe. So there's a lot of projects that have been approved. They're going through the planning process. There's funding in the future. And it's a direct response to some of the same things you're saying, is provide opportunities for the south side to lift up. And when government shows that they are investing in those areas, the private sector, we hope, will respond.
Used its discretion to not facilitate big new development in the north. I mean, if it happens under existing rules without government have to doing anything, that's one thing. But for the government to take action to facilitate big new development in the north, doesn't that suck up the demand for housing that you've identified that otherwise might have to go somewhere else that would be more consistent with the city's overall strategy?
Well, I think the market responds to the public investment. So if there's public investment in the Northeast, yes, they're going to respond to the Northeast. If there's public investment to the South, like FAMU Way, we've seen public investment there. So I think the answer is when you start investing in all parts of your community, there's going to be development that is going to go towards those investments. We're not going to spend, let's say, the $1.4 billion of public investment along Orange Avenue, and the community's not going to respond. They will respond to that investment that is occurring along Orange Avenue.
Okay, thanks. I also wanted to go back to Grant's original questions about the population study. So it sounds like there was a study in 2007 about the need for the population growth and the need for additional housing units. But you think that that study is flawed, it sounds like, and its conclusions are not valid. So will there be, or has there been, a new study to replace that old flawed one?
Artie, you want to handle that?
I can handle that. Yes. So I would, for what that study was intended to do, which at the time of that year, the state actually had a requirement that we do a residential land use analysis. Um, the study was good for what it was intended to do. However, when we start trying to use data for purposes other than what they're intended to do, you start running into issues where the assumptions that were made for the original purpose don't align with the assumptions that would be needed to be made for kind of the new purpose. And that's kind of the situation we have with that study. So I don't want to sound too down on that study because it did do what it was intended to accomplish. It just doesn't work for this specific question. So when we look at these kind of analyses, there's going to have to be a lot of assumptions that are made. And when you try to make a decision using just pure data, you have to start questioning other things that are outside of the data. And so I guess what I mean by that is if we were to try to replicate that kind of study to look at population accommodation, we would really have to make some assumptions about what the market is going to do over the next 20 to 30 years with regards to not only housing, but also commercial, retail, office, things like that. We have a number of land use categories. In fact, most of our land use categories allow both residential and non-residential development. And so a good example of that is that suburban land use category that I kind of mentioned earlier in the presentation. That land use category will allow everything from something like a shopping mall or a shopping center, maybe like the Best Buy shopping center on Appalachia Parkway or the Governor Square Mall or something like that, or a residential development up to 20 units per acre. If we tried to look at all the property in the community and guess what that property would develop as within the next 20 to 30 years, it would essentially be that. It would be a guess. If we see a property that's designated suburban, it would be really hard to know what 15 years from now that property would become. We also would have to look at things like a complete tree inventory of every tree in the community. As you're probably aware, the community doesn't really like to cut down too many of those trees. And when we do these analyses, we don't account for that level of grain with the data, largely because we wouldn't have the ability, or it would take until 2035 to go and look at every single tree on every single vacant property in all of Welaunee County. And so we can start making assumptions and try to run numbers and look at it. But then if we say, okay, we can accommodate things by developing this vacant parcel as residential, not commercial. Oh, but there's a tree there, so that's going to limit how much we can do, or we're going to have to cut down the tree. And so you start getting into value judgments in terms of what do we want to do? Do we want to promote infill, density, max out what can be built, or do we want to preserve this live oak? Same thing with historic structures. We can look at it and say, okay, we can subdivide this property and build it out to the maximum allowed, or we can preserve this historic structure. Also things with neighborhoods. So if you have a vacant parcel in a residential preservation 1 or 2, or an R1 and R2 zoned, these are single family zoning districts properties, you cannot subdivide that property more than 10% less than the median size of the median parcel size of that subdivision. And so now there's another layer on top of that. And then we would look at things like parking requirements and stormwater. That is unique to each site. You have to look at which way the stormwater would flow. And so if you were to do something more than a single family house or duplex, you would have to account for stormwater. And now we're looking site by site by site. And just the ability to do that level of analysis, again, I just don't even think that it's feasible to do that. So we do generally look at trends. We look at what our population projections are going to be. we look at the need, we look at what we have. But if we're looking at that kind of analysis that's kind of being requested, it's just, there would be so many assumptions that I don't even think that it would be feasible to do.
As I listened to the reason for recommending approval of the comp plan amendments, what I heard was, oh, well, this was anticipated all along, and there's not enough, there's not an ability to put this much housing in the existing service area. But it sounds like you're saying you don't really know if it's possible to put this much housing in the existing service area. The 2001 study doesn't tell you, and doing a study to tell you would be too expensive, too complicated, take too long. So it's not clear to me what the basis is for saying that there's not enough room in the existing service area. But the other thing is, if the idea is for planning to steer development, have you looked at, and if the urban service area did need to be expanded, and if there were a desire to have that expansion go south rather than north, have you looked at potential areas to expand the urban service area on the south side, opening up for more development? And then if there were a need, if the population went up so fast that there would be a need to expand the urban service area, it could go where seems we're saying we want it to go, even though the developers aren't choosing to go there. I don't know, does that make sense?
I'll take an initial cut at this way, and if that's okay, and if you want to add in. But one of the things that I wanted to point out on the south side, if we start looking at moving more and more development there, or potentially expanding the urban services to that area, is you run up against the primary springs protection zone. And so the more development that you start looking at on that side of town, especially within that area, we have to really be considerate of the implications that has to the overall underground network that feeds into we'll call it springs and the spring system, as well as if we start looking at the Bradfordville chain of lakes, there are special development zones around there as well, because we're trying to protect that. If we look at the northeast as well, there's also a land use category, lake protection, which has kind of restrictions on development and additional standards for development in that area, because we're trying to protect Lake Jackson. So, you know, on the surface, it's easy to look and say, oh, well, we should just expand the urban service area to the south. But if you start looking into those different value judgments that you have to make, you have to start asking those questions. Do you want to promote more growth in the primary springs protection zone, in the chain of lakes development zones, in the Lake Jackson lake protection areas, or do we want to put more priority on preserving certain environmental features and things like that? So those are those value trade-offs that I kind of mentioned a moment ago.
Well, that's a good point. I certainly don't want. I certainly don't want to do anything to hurt Wakulla Springs and the other springs down there. Well, what about the west side? It seems like the west side is kind of lower income and less development on the west side. Are there environmental issues there too?
Well, before you guys start, Steve, I'll give just a couple, a few seconds for Artie or Wayne to respond to that. But then I'd like to wrap it up, and I still have 3 other speakers that I want to make sure we get to. So if we could finish this up, and then we'll move on. So did Artie or Wayne, did you want to speak to that last point briefly?
Yeah, so the west side is included in the Wakulla Springs protection area as well. There's a significant part of the Springs protection zone that runs along the Highway 20 corridor. And then there's National Forest out there. So National Forest constrains us on the southwest part of our community.
Okay, I'm going to put you mute, Steve, if you wouldn't mind taking your hand off, so if it comes back again, I could see it. And then I'm going to move then to Teresa Wells. I'm going to go ahead and unmute your mic now, Teresa.
Good morning, everyone. I want to say I do appreciate the opportunity to participate and to have this conversation. I am concerned.
Teresa, could you get a little closer to the microphone? It's a little hard to hear you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to participate and to even have this conversation. I am concerned that it took such an outcry for it to happen. And I am concerned that we're not able to connect in a more meaningful way with our elected officials. I also appreciate Steve Bean's questions, and I echo Darwin Gamble's sentiments. Thank you.
Very much.
Okay. So I think that was a good statement, Teresa. That I just want to make sure you didn't have anything else before I move on.
Well, I'm obviously concerned about the amendments.
Okay.
But I appreciate the input from staff, and that will help me know how I want to proceed.
Okay.
Thank you
very much, Teresa. Thank you.
And Teresa, if I could add, so the City Commission did have a conversation about public participation at their last meeting. I will tell you, if you reach out to your commissioners, they will respond. And I know straight out of the word, Commissioner Williams Cox, she'll make herself available from daylight to dark, and she means that. So I do encourage you, if you need to follow up with your elected officials, you have access to them. And so no one's holding you back. And I don't want you to feel like this is the only way you can communicate your concerns to our city commissioners and our county commissioners. They should be available to you.
Okay. So the next one who has raised their hands is Neil. Neil, are you still around? It looks like. Are you there? Neil, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Cherie.
Sure.
And I appreciate Wayne and Cherie and Artie. Thank you for putting this together. I had a bit of a bad connection at the beginning when I believe with Wayne was discussing the phasing plan for the arch. Can you just briefly, I guess, summarize the metrics that are associated with phasing development in the arch?
Yeah, Artie, why don't you respond
I
to
can do
that?
that. Yes, so we're looking at having both a metric for residential as well as non-residential development in phase one before moving on to residential development in phase two. And we were looking at, before you can move into phase two, phase one would have 3,000 dwelling units per acre and 500,000 square feet of non-residential development. That is approximately 50% of what the non-residential entitlements would be. We recognized that when you would go in to start building non-residential, you may need some of the residential from phase two to support the non-residential. But we didn't want to move forward with that residential until the first part did. So it would be 3,000 dwelling units and 500,000 square feet of non-residential development in phase one before phase two could occur, or you'd meet the horizon year of the comp plan, which is 2035.
Okay, and that was going to be my follow-up question is, do you have a sense from a timing perspective, given growth rates and growth patterns, what timing we're looking at in terms of maybe achieving those metrics? Is it basically you think we'll get there around 2035?
I don't know if we can predict the future, Neil.
Yeah.
You know, we can look at what Artie was saying earlier. We can look at trends and look at what's happening in our community. But you also have to look at what's happening with the family, and the family basically controls whether they move forward or not with any development. And right now, I've seen no interest whatsoever from the family to develop the property. I only see interest in making sure that it's entitled right now, why it's easy to entitle it under a one single property owner condition. One thing I don't know, can you see the map in front of you, Neil?
Yes, I can, Wayne.
Okay, so, and I'm not sure if you heard the phasing part. So phase 2 would be everything outside of the urban service area today. So that's probably over half of the property would be delayed until 2035.
Okay, and that was going to be my follow-up question. Okay, I appreciate. I think that bringing phasing in is just critical. You and I, Wayne, talked about this at another public meeting a few months ago, and that I think was just a huge missing component, and is a big improvement. Is there another phasing component transitioning from the development in the toe and the heel, leading into development in the arch? In other words, is there also a phasing component that says we have to hit certain milestones in the toe and the heel before we begin that development in the arch?
I'm not aware of that, Artie.
I'd have to defer to Sheree on that. Not in the comp plan.
No, those the toe and the heel have, they already have the master planning done and laid out, but there aren't, as far as phasing, these have to be done before the next. No, we haven't. That's not anticipated in the comp plan.
Okay, thank you. And then just the final question is, increasing those densities, I think is critical. I'm glad to see that you did that. Is our minimum densities associated with those two? In other words, increasing from 6 dwelling units to from 6 to 10, and then from 1 to 6 in the residential reserve. But are there minimum development densities associated with those to ensure that we are more efficiently utilizing the land in Welaunee?
Artie?
Not in the comprehensive plan. That may be something that would be included in the plan unit development, but it's not in the comprehensive plan.
So that's obviously, something that you might need to look into. It's great that we have those higher end densities to ensure that we more efficiently utilize the land that's there and do so in an environmentally responsible manner. But sometimes, unless we have those lower thresholds of minimum development densities, you're not going to see us begin to approach those higher densities there. Thank you very much for the responses. I appreciate it.
No, Neil, that's a good comment on the minimum. I'm going to ask staff to kind of look at that a little closer before we get to the transmittal here.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Go ahead and put your hand down if you wouldn't mind. Christique, you are next. I'm going to unmute you. Christique, are you still there?
Hi, good morning. How are you?
Good, good.
Good. So I was looking just very briefly at the summary. I've been acquainted with this plan for a number of years. So I heard neighborhood input on this for about 9 years in regards to Welaunee. So I'm very strongly against the growth over there just because of value principles. But my question is this, being in real estate, I know that there is a land scarcity, which is driving up affordability or driving affordability, escaping, affordability is escaping us. I also know that homes that are put on the market below 200,000 are on the market for about 7 days before they're under contract if they're move-in ready. So I know, and I also know that there's only 700 homes that are move-in ready on the market. And when I say move-in ready, there are homes, these are homes that actually are standing and aren't, under construction. So the market has a demand. What I'm concerned about how the thought process is with this development and how, in light of the recent statute change regarding the need to do inclusionary housing, how is this going to benefit all citizens in the city in regards to, because there's a social economic divide that is lengthening, with the current crisis and with the continual decrease of the interest rate. So has there been any conversation on how policy is going to kind of encourage or incentivize the continued awareness of developers to create housing stock that is affordable and accessible to all residents of the city? And my second question would be, has there been a cost benefit analysis conducted on this particular aspect that citizens can access and review?
All right. Artie, you want to respond initially?
I can try to do the initial response, though affordable housing is not my area of specialty. I've done some deep dives into it recently. The comprehensive plan amendment for this area does imply and would require that the development in this area meet the city's inclusionary housing policy. That is the mechanism by which the city has to provide affordable housing. There are other programs through the Housing and Human Services Department, and I don't know if we have anyone from them available, but there are other programs that can help with different aspects of affordable housing. From an overall community-wide look, there are a couple of things that can drive up the cost of housing. One is just the supply and demand. And so by increasing the supply of housing, you help keep in a way that either matches or slightly exceeds demand. That does help with the overall price point for housing in the community. Once you start seeing restrictions on the number of units and the difficulty it is to build more, the housing stock that's existing does go up in price. It's just kind of the supply demand curve, if you will, of housing. There are also other things to account for with regards to the cost of housing, and that is how much it actually costs to build and construct it. And so as we look at different things that make infill more expensive to build, whether that is simple things like increasing the notification requirements, if you look at the additional public meetings that would have to be held, if you look at restrictions on what can be built next to existing neighborhoods, many of these other things, as you start adding to those become costs that the developer would then have to translate into a higher price point for the product that is built, so a house or an apartment or a duplex. And so one of the things that we're looking at is how all of these things interact and interplay. And so it's the housing stock, the amount available, the requirements of developers, the amount of things that add to the cost of development, as well as what just the materials cost at the time. So there's a lot of moving pieces in the affordable housing conversation that some of them we can address through the comp plan, land use, and some of them require additional programs.
Okay. Christique, if it's okay with you, I'm going to move on. We've got about 10 minutes and I still have 2 people in line. Do you feel comfortable with that answer?
I didn't get an answer to whether so I guess I'm assuming there hasn't been a cost benefit analysis done on this particular action.
No, ma'am, we've not done that.
Okay. Is there any intention in Wayne to do one that we would be able to have and kind of be able to review?
I think we could do it. We certainly couldn't do it before the transmittal hearing, but within the next month between transmittal and adoption, we could do that. I think you're going to find it's going to be substantial.
Yeah, that I would definitely love to have that information. I think that the residents and the citizens would like to know what the cost benefit analysis is with this expansion. It will help.
Yeah, I believe there was, Christique, I believe there was one that was done for the canopy development that we might be able to just lift real quick. And so you do a multiplier. If this development is 3 times as large or 4 times as large, or maybe much larger than that, you might be able to just do a multiplier effect. I'm not sure that's not good science in my opinion, but if we wanted to dive down a little deeper, we can do that. That's no problem.
Okay, thank you, Wayne.
Thank you. Okay, thanks, Christique. I'm going to mute you back. Okay, Deborah Lawson, you're the next one. You should be able to speak now.
Great, thank you.
Oh, Deborah, you were very faint. If you could get closer.
Sorry about that.
There we go. Okay.
There you go. I said I'm sorry for raising my hand late. I thought I had done it correctly and then realized I hadn't. So my first question is an easy one. Can we get a copy of the presentation that we've worked with today? that, that you've put up on the screen?
Sure, we'll
And how do we do that?
we'll email it to every one of the attendees if we can do that. I think we have part of the registration email address. We'll just send it to you.
Great, that would be really appreciated. There's some really good maps and things in here. My second question is, you mentioned briefly about the energy component of the development agreement, I believe. And I'm curious, can you be a little more specific about some of the transportation issues that are being addressed?
Yes, I can do that if you'd like me to, Wayne and Sheree. Well, I will say that the comp plan sets out the broad parameters that will be fleshed out in more detail when you get to the next phase, which in this case would be the plan unit development. And so the policies basically say that when you get to the plan unit development phase, that plan unit development must address how land use and transportation will be considered together. It puts an emphasis on looking at increasing energy efficiency through having more compact development, having more walkable development, making sure that those different districts that we talked about, we have the residential district and that mixed use district, making sure that there's accessibility and interconnection between those. So you would be able to walk or ride a bike from the residential areas to those mixed use and non-residential development areas. Looking at basically neighborhood design is the way that would have to be explained in the plan unit development.
Okay. All right. The other question I had is just about the HEAL, because that's already in the USA. And we don't hear anything at all about plans to develop that. It's accessible to the existing I-10 interchange, and surrounded by, other residential development. And I'm just curious why, why we're thinking about expanding the USA into those 2,800 rural acres when there's 1,000 acres there in the HEAL that seem, appropriate for development at this time.
I agree that the Hill is very appropriate for development. And in fact, I've encouraged some of the representatives from that area. This would be a good target area. But however, going back to the 1990 agreement, there were promises made to the property owner that says if you annex into the city, you have the ability to be a full city infrastructure recipient and get the rights of living in the city, which means by the comp plan says you get urban densities and intensities, and if you're inside the city. So this is it, so everyone I think is really concerned that we're going to move the line and all of a sudden you're going to see homes start popping up out in this area. And that's not the case. It's just good planning to look ahead when we have the chance to take this large acreage and do it today while we've got the people at the table to say, how can we plan this thing to look into the future and do it the right way? If we build a road through this corridor and we don't consider the land use, then we're probably going to fail. And if we do the land use and not build a road, then we're probably going to fail. So this is kind of more of a planning exercise. And I do not see, and if the developers representatives online, if they want to speak into this, I see no intentions of the developer moving forward with developing this property in the near future.
And I do have Gary. Gary Hunter's the next one. So Deborah, if that's okay, we can move on to Gary. I'm going to go ahead and mute you. So thank you
very much.
Thank you. Gary, you are the last speaker I have in line.
Okay, can you hear me, Sheree?
Yes.
Great, thank you. And thank all of you with the planning department for putting this together and those from the public who participated with good questions. I am the representative of the owners of the Arch of Powerhouse Inc., which is the family corporation that owns these lands. I think to address a few points and reiterate what Wayne just said, and Ms. Lawson, I agree with you, and I think the family agrees with you The Heel is an area that has a plan on it presently. And so if a parcel of our land holdings were to develop in the immediate future, we agree that that would be the parcel to develop. It's available if someone wanted to come buy it, has been for some time, and remains that way. And so I think you're probably right in the progression of development in that part of the community. That's the likely place it would happen first. We have, and Wayne, just to follow up on what you just said a minute ago regarding our intentions, and you referred to us as the developer's representative, and I'm just going to correct you slightly. We aren't developers. We never have been and never will be. My clients own this land, and their family has owned it generationally, as most of the people on the phone I'm sure know. They never have any intention of developing that property. They are of the mindset that if we're going to plan roadway networks through the property, a future potential I-10 interchange at that property where they've reserved right away for at least the north portion of that future interchange to have the on and off ramps and put the supporting roadway network through the property, that it makes sense to do the land planning concurrent with that. And we've been patient in that respect. Really, I mean, Wayne, you mentioned it, and I think Artie did too, dating back to 1990 when this initial urban services agreement was executed between the city and the family, where we agreed to annex our property into the city for the ability to get urban services. That line should have probably been moved concurrent with that annexation, and nobody did that. And at the time, there were no major roadway systems being planned through the property. As we all know, the Northeast Gateway project is real now. It's a tier 1 project within the blueprint efforts. And one of the projects that's going forward in the foreseeable years, so in the next few years, being planned now and ultimately will be constructed. And we have every intention of donating the right of way for that blueprint, for the Welaunee Boulevard extension, for Shamrock, for the interchange, if there ever is one. But we do think, and I've seen this around Florida, where I've had the benefit of doing other large area plans, where you've got greenscape basically on cattle pasture, orange groves, whatever they happen to be, large parcels of land in developing parts of our state, where it always makes sense to be concurrent with the land planning and the transportation planning. And so our feeling now is, while we should have probably done this a while ago, it makes sense to go ahead and move the urban service line. We're comfortable with the phasing because, as I said a minute ago, there's no intention of developing that property in the immediate future. The families get recently planted in varying stages, but in the last 5 years, over 1,200 acres of planted pine trees. They're smart people from the standpoint of how they manage their land. They wouldn't have invested a lot of money in the plantings of planted pine stands if they intended to go develop that property. Planted pine stands typically aren't what you would use as an amenity to a development. You just mow them down and plant whatever else a developer, when they came in, intended to put there. So I think all of those things hopefully are responsive to some of the concerns of the public. We do feel strongly that if you're gonna plan the roads, you ought to plan the property. We've never spoken to, and I say this sincerely, I know y'all can't see my faces, but we've never spoken to a developer about any of the land in the Arch ever, and have no intention of doing that anytime soon. But I know the generation of family members that reside on that property today, who are entering later stages of their life, they're in their 70s, are of the mindset that they'd like to see how that property is going to be developed in the future generations to come, if it ever were to be developed. And so that's what's going on. Neil, and I'm sorry to call you by your first name, I didn't hear your last. You mentioned the densities up in the northeastern part of the site. Minimum densities would be fine with us. I mean, I think from a from a lawyer who has represented developers for a long time, I will tell you that you couldn't do it doesn't work without some minimum densities there, because the developer, whoever ultimately that is going to have to put in the infrastructure to support what's being built. And economically, it wouldn't make sense to do that at low density. You're inside the city, so you have to do, once this amendment would occur, we'd have to do water and sewer lines. There's no well and septic that would occur there. And the consequence of that would be you want densities to support the level of development that was taking place. And finally, just on the part about phasing into the arch, there's no phasing that would stop anyone from developing the portion of the arch that's currently in PD, or even the portion of the arch that's currently rural. I mean, we could go do that on smaller lots with its current densities. There's no intent to do that, but I think this plan that the planning department has put together actually reduces what we could do on the portion that's already in the urban service area. So we could go develop that property right now very intensely, more so than the plan that Artie and his team have assembled, but that's not our intent. And so I just wanted to point that out. If our intent were to go fast track develop it, we could do that very intensely right now without the protections that are being put in place with this plan amendment. And I hope that demonstrates that our goal with all of this was to plan the whole property, not to go in and turn and burn dirt for purposes of development. It just isn't that way. And I'll stop at that. I think there've been good questions asked, hopefully, and I thought Artie and Cherie and Wayne, y'all's team did a good job responding to them, and hopefully I've added some additional support for the responses that you provided.
Thank you, Gary. I'm going to go ahead and mute you again. We're past 11, or it's 11:04. I've got one person who was in the queue before 11. So if it's okay with everyone, I'm going to go ahead and Wayne and Artie, if you still have time, I'm going to go ahead and let that one person speak.
Go ahead, Sheree. I don't want to miss the opportunity if there's just one remaining.
I felt the same way. So, all right. So, Robert Bell, you are on the line now.
My name's Robert Bell. I live at 4419 Argyle Lane in Miccosukee Meadows, which is directly adjacent to the property. My questions refer to a map I saw earlier. It's not up now, where it shows 3 entrances from the property onto Miccosukee Road. One of them is the through that comes from Shamrock all the way to 90. The other 2 dead end onto Miccosukee Road. What type of studies have been done to see that this road, which is already close to maximum, is protected from all of those additional people from the arch flooding onto Miccosukee Road? My second question is, it shows that they dead into Miccosukee Road. What's to prevent them from being extended through the greenway to the heel?
Through the greenway to the hill. Okay, so Artie, you want to just go over the plan real quick?
I'm looking at.
Yes, and I know some of this goes back to the original agreement that created the Miccosukee Greenway. Correct me if I'm incorrect on this, Wayne or Cherie, but when the Miccosukee Greenway was originally created and put into place, that agreement included intersections that would cross the Miccosukee Greenway. So part of the stipulation for us to even be able to do the Greenway was that future roadway crossings would be provided. If it weren't for that, we wouldn't have the Greenway today. There is also potential connections to Centerville. You can see one at Shamrock, the other one would be north of that. The specific location to be determined as engineering and planning is at a higher grain of details done for this area. The intent is to create an overall network of roads kind of see what's here, there could potentially be more as well to distribute the traffic so it wouldn't all go onto Miccosukee Road. In fact, the intent would be for the majority of it to go onto Welaunee Boulevard. That's kind of part of the overall network and would be the predominant spine. We're very cognizant of Centerville Road and Miccosukee Road, Canopy Road status, not wanting to put much additional traffic on that as much as possible. And so the emphasis really would be Welaunee Boulevard. There are other pieces that are moving. One of those crossings, I think, would be the extension of Thornton Road, but I know that that's going to require some coordination with the state in terms of the agreement that was originally made.
Changes to those access points require action from the governor and the cabinet.
Okay. Yes.
Looking specifically at the ones that are outside of I-10, outside of Miles Johnson Road.
Yes, sir. So what we need to do, and this is a fair question, so let us go back and look at the Miccosukee Greenway Agreement, unless Gary Hunter can respond to this. When the Greenway was created, so the state allowed, I guess, purchases of property, but there's special stipulations regarding access for roadways and things like that. That's in the Miccosukee Roadway Agreement with the state and Leon County, which basically says this is where your access points are, and that's it. But there are opportunities if we kind of get down the road, and just like we're doing south of I-10, what we found was that there was an access approved from the city's property down through Arendelle. And the neighborhood folks said, hey, you have the potential of putting traffic through our local residential street. And we agreed. Now, that was about 3 or 4 years ago. And we're trying to get a audience in front of DEP and the governor and cabinet to relocate that access point to Thornton Road. And so, like I said before, to relocate in this particular case, it takes the governor and cabinet to approve that relocation of the access point. So we have the ability, if that's what's required for those others, and so we need to verify if that is the actual process for relocating those access points. But that is something that we can look a little closer and respond back to you, Mr. Bell. That's a fair question.
And the second part about what is to prevent them from going and continuing through the Greenway into the heel?
I think it's the same comment I just said, is that the state has a lot of control over what happens to that Greenway.
Okay. I have other questions, but I know time's at a premium here, and I just wanted to say that it's a shame that we have to do this. The method that we're using, I have contacted the county commissioners and the city commissioners. It's apparent that this forum, very poor alternative and for the face-to-face public hearing required for public input. It's wrong time to push this thing through without us being able to meet face-to-face to discuss these issues.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, I don't have any other speakers in the queue, and we're past 11. So did you want to wrap it up, Wayne?
Sure. Again, so we probably, Cherie, just to reiterate how the individuals, if they want to provide comments to the city commission and county commission, how they can do that. So our commission is very intent. When you have the ability to write in comments, you're not limited to the 3 minutes that you're limited at the podium. And I do understand face-to-face contact. I love to have that contact as well. But I do know when we have the ability to write out our thoughts, we can do it much clearer sometimes than getting at the podium and getting nervous and things like that. So you're not limited in 3-minute conversation and emails. We certainly have received some very lengthy responses from committees, and we want to put all of those comments in the hands of the commissioners before they make that policy decision. And I'll go as far as this too, is if this is actually transmitted to the state, staff doesn't quit here. And if there are things like Mr. Bell indicated, when we get closer to figuring out what's going to happen in the future, staff will always make it a priority to be in the community to work through these issues, just like we're doing today. And just like we've listened to you all over the last 4 to 5 months, that is our obligation to the community. And as long as I'm responsible for this service area, that will always happen. And I will guarantee that. And so with that, Cherie, again, thank you all for participating. And Cherie, if you just go over how they can provide comments to the commissioners.
Sure. In the email invitation that went out, there were links to the city and county agenda items, the city agenda item. You can also provide it on the county agenda, but there was a link in the one that Wayne sent that you go to provide your comments. So even also looking on board docs at this agenda item, it gives the directions for how to submit your comments online. And then if you have any problems with that, you can certainly reach out to Artie or myself, and we'll make sure to help you get you through the process. With that, then, I guess we are done. So we'll wrap it up. You can email me if you need to, cherie.bryant@talgov.com if you have any problems running into anything. And I appreciate everyone's time and enjoyed the opportunity to talk with everyone. So again, thank you, and we'll wrap it up.